Nobody knows where or how the bubonic plague started, but it is generally accepted that its origins come from Central or Eastern Asia. In fact, we have accounts of Tatars? We have records of these people using plague victims as biological warfare. They would catapult the corpses of people who died from the bubonic plague over walls into cities, or even strap parts of them to cannonballs in order to introduce plague into cities so that they could weaken them and take them more easily, which is pretty gross. The bubonic plague is caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis, which, even though we can't be 100% sure, we're fairly certain traveled through fleas on rats, in clothing, livestock, etc. These fleas then transferred the bacteria into the human population. Over the course of the next several years, anywhere from 75 to 200 million people worldwide died from the bubonic plague. Now, I know what you're thinking. 75 to 200 million is a very wide range, and you're probably wondering if we can narrow that down anymore. The answer is, frankly, no, we can't. You see, records in the 1340s, particularly in rural areas, were, to put it lightly, not so great. We don't really know exactly how many people lived in much of these areas in the first place, let alone how many of them died. The best we can do is make an educated guess based on the data that we do have, and that data leads us to the margin of 75 to 200 million people. Now, that number of 75 to 200 million people may or may not sound like a large number to you, so let me put it in perspective. That is approximately 30% of the entire world's population at that time. In Europe, the plague was especially terrible, and even though ranges vary from country to country, some places saw 90% of their population killed off by the plague. So many people died that we are still digging up previously undiscovered graveyards filled with plague victims. In fact, so many people died from the plague that we're fairly certain that the reduced carbon footprint of humans ended up contributing to what we now call the Little Ice Age. I'm going to take a moment to pause right here and drink from my vitamin C enhanced herbal tea. Tastes like lemon and paranoia. Symptoms of the plague, much like any other disease, varied in severity. Some people experienced simply fevers and aches and pains. Other people experienced much, much worse. The worst symptom would include growing buboes all over your body. You see, throughout your body, you have these things called lymph nodes. Think of your lymph nodes as like collection centers of a garbage chute so that your body can more easily and effectively clean itself. You have many small lymph nodes spread all over your body, but you have some really big ones right behind your ears, underneath your jaws, in your armpits, and along your thighs. For some reason, Yersinia pestis loves to infest your lymph nodes. Infecting your lymph nodes does two things. First, it prevents your body from effectively cleaning itself out. Second, it results in symptoms that are the reason we call Yersinia pestis the Black Death. Yersinia pestis congregates in your lymph nodes, causing them to swell and turn black in the process. Plague victims were usually covered in head to toe by these black lumps called buboes. Some of these lymph nodes would even swell to the size of an apple. It's a good apple. Now, because your lymph nodes aren't effectively cleaning out your body, it makes the rest of your system start to shut down with all the waste or other infections. Oftentimes, the skin at the tips of your extremities would die and turn gangrenous. And because your lymph nodes are the part of your body that would help clean all of that out, you're just kind of screwed. Just like we don't know for sure exactly how the plague started, we also don't know exactly how it ended. But we still have some pretty good ideas. First off, we have the idea of herd immunity. Just like with any disease, some people are going to survive, and those people are going to gain some level of immunity to the disease going forward. Once we get to a point where almost everybody has some form of immunity, the plague is going to stop spreading nearly as frequently. On top of that, people, even if only temporarily, improved their hygiene habits. Some people noticed that the other people who washed their hands and regularly bathed didn't get sick as much, and so they started doing those same things. Which makes sense, because one of the easy ways to get rid of fleas is to bathe yourself frequently. A third possible reason is that people noticed the majority of those who were dying from the plague had inherited the clothes of other people who died from the plague. These clothes presumably filled with fleas carrying Yersinia pestis. So they started burning the bodies and clothing of people who died from the plague, and what do you know? Fewer people were getting the plague. Even though the plague did come largely to a close, society had already drastically changed, and there was no going back. To use our modern day COVID-related vocabulary, they had a new normal that they had to adjust to. There was no getting around it. You see, the plague was no respecter of persons. It killed rich and poor, royalty and peasantry alike. If you've seen any of the Marvel movies, you would know that Thanos had this idea to kill off half of all living things in the universe in order to create essentially a resource surplus. To be honest, the plague had a similar effect. With as much as 75% of Europe's population suddenly dead, there were open government positions, open working positions, extra food, livestock was wandering from field to field, even down empty roads and cities, houses were left empty, land was left untended. All of this meant that peasants now had a lot more bargaining power. You see, a lot of peasants never really owned their own land, they just had the privilege of living and working the land that someone else owned. And that person usually was a member of the royal family or a person appointed by the royal family to tend the king's land. But now most of those landlords were dead, as were most of the people who would work those fields and lived on those fields. So these peasants just kind of took the land for themselves, and there was nobody there to really stop or question them. And a lot of people who already did own land were suddenly able to absorb their neighbor land. Many peasants rose from subsistence farming to levels of affluence in a matter of months. Even people who didn't own land still benefited in a very major way. You see, demand for hard labor had stayed the same, if not increasing over the course of the plague, while the supply quite literally died off. This put the bargaining power into the hands of the laborers, who could demand higher wages or go somewhere else where they would get those wages. But perhaps most significant is that many scholars claim the Black Death directly led to the Renaissance. You see, Italy was particularly hard hit by the plague, with some towns seeing more than 90% of their population die off. The theory is that because the Italian citizens saw so much death around them, that many of the survivors started to dwell on their own lives and spirituality. This in turn created a new wave of religious fervor, and one of the ways that this religious fervor manifested was in church-sponsored artworks. Now, when you add to that an influx of Greek philosophers moving into the Italian peninsula, as well as people deciding to go out and explore the Roman ruins around their homes, we end up seeing a rediscovery of the old way of doing things. In fact, the word Renaissance itself literally means rediscovery. People started going back to Roman ways of art, architecture, philosophy. The combination of these factors brings us the great minds of Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo. Of course, I mean Da Vinci, because we're not talking about the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, we're talking about the Renaissance artists. But on a side note, isn't it kind of weird to think about how the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles only exist because of the Black Plague? I'm gonna let you stew on that one for half a second. Even though the Renaissance was a golden era of art and philosophy, it doesn't mean that everything in the post-plague world was hunky-dory. Some ethnic and religious groups were actually blamed for the plague. Jews, for example, were often kicked out of their homelands if they weren't killed outright, and forced to find shelter in other places. Many of them traveled to Poland, where for some reason the effects of the plague were much less severe and people were more open-minded about religion and ethnicity. Other zealots thought the plague was God's punishment for some sins that they had committed, and they would go from town to town flagellating themselves. The idea here being that their pain was a sacrifice to God to try and take this plague away. It's also important to note that the plague never actually went away. People simply gained herd immunity to Yersinia pestis, and there have been many outbreaks since the Great Plague of the 1340s. For example, in 1995, there was an outbreak in Madagascar where thousands of people were infected with Yersinia pestis and 170 people died. People still get the plague today in 2022, and when left untreated, it has an 80% fatality rate within 8 days of contraction. That being said, if you do treat it, you are almost certain to survive. All of this brings a very interesting perspective. You see, I'm making this video based on an article I wrote earlier this year, 2022, on what we hoped is the tail end of the COVID-19 pandemic. Here I am now sitting in late 2022 after more than 2 full years of the pandemic, and it's still not fully over. Over the last 2 years, we've seen hundreds of millions of COVID-19 cases and millions of COVID-related deaths. And just like the Black Plague, it doesn't seem like COVID is going anywhere anytime soon. But looking at past pandemics like the Spanish flu or the Bubonic Plague, we can get an idea of what to expect. People are gaining herd immunity, cases are going down, and when people do contract COVID, their survivability rate is significantly higher than what it was 2 years ago. From a historian's perspective, though, the stories of COVID-19 and the Bubonic Plague are not all that different. I don't look at the stories of COVID-19 and the Bubonic Plague just as a disease that ravished the human race. I also see these stories as a prime example of humanity's ability to adapt and overcome any challenge. While that doesn't mean we have all the answers right now, and probably never will, it does give me a lot of hope that we can and probably will survive and overcome a lot of these other major crises that we're facing. And that's not just some naively optimistic outlook on the human race, because the data has shown that we have always overcome every major crisis. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe for more in the future. Good apple.